Right, so let's talk about user interface testing. So we're going to have the same kind of challenges that we have seen, that we have faced when we're testing Java code, right, on the server. Right, that we have dependencies of code with other resources such as databases or network running on a server, having to respond to HTTP requests and so on and so forth. That those same issues, those same challenges that we have on the server that we look to isolate, we're going to have the same kind of challenges on the client side as well. Right? We have the fact that we're running on a framework such as a browser that parses the HTML, parses the JavaScript, runs them in a browser, and then it generates this object model, the domain object model, and then uses this to render something on the screen. We need to be able to automate that in such a way that there is no such thing as a browser or somebody manually visiting an actual page and running it and visually looking at this. Right? We need to make it so that these DOM objects, right? Somehow we can perhaps have a base version of this DOM, and then if somehow logically has changed from one as development progresses, if we somehow the DOM is not what we expect, we want to be notified, right? So we need to have a kind of a base representation of the pages, right, and be able to compare if we have inadvertently made the page look something that it's not supposed to look like, right? That if we were expecting, certain anchors here and certain headings and certain list items over there, that indeed our logic is indeed generating the formatting that we're expecting, right? But without needing an actual browser, without needing anything, something that we can automate and have that it's repeatable. The other challenge is that oftentimes these dynamic rendering of these pages are based on data that doesn't live on the browser, right? It's data that lives remotely on some server, and that server in turn depends on some other database, right? So there's some other dependencies that we need somehow to mock, right? We need to sever that dependency between our client-side code, right, and any dependencies with data sources that live remotely. There's also the fact that typically these web front ends respond to human interaction, right? As folks, they type certain things, they move their mouses around, they click and they drag and they generate a stream of events that causes the application to transition from one state to the another state, right? And we like to be able to verify, right, that indeed this application is indeed transitioning from one state from an expected state to another expected state when we stimulate the application to certain input events, right? So we need to be able to automate all these streams of events, right? If folks are moving their mouse or they're clicking or they're doing that, we need to automate the user interaction in different sequences in a particular set of sequences, and verify that the application responds accordingly as expected. So we need to somehow address all these dependencies and mock them, so that we can simulate somehow this in a way that it's that we expect, right? That behaves as we expect. So we need to isolate all these components from their dependencies, and we need to have mechanisms that we can just run a set of unit tests, and then they can go through and execute the user interface and compare actual responses with what expected responses are. So isolating the browser entails looking at the rendering engine that the browser provides, right? That parses the HTML, parses the JavaScript, does some magic, right, and then generates an object representation of running that JavaScript on that particular HTML. And we need to be able to remove this browser and exercise this HTML, this JavaScript, and generate an equivalent DOM, right? An equivalent DOM that we can maybe use as a base input, right, and say, okay, well, this is what the expected DOM is, and then compare, as we go forward, if we break it somehow, right, that it's somehow we introduce new features or we make any changes that used to generate the DOM we expected, but no longer generate the DOM that we expect, right? So we need to replace replace the browser with a testing mechanism, a testing harness that can take a look at various versions of the HTML and various versions of the JavaScript, and look at and generate the equivalent DOM representations of that of these HTML and running these JavaScript, and then compare. And is it what we expect? Is the application behaving correctly as it transitions from one data model to another data model? Right? So we need to isolate and remove the browser and replicate a lot of its functionality of generating these DOM, at least to a level of granularity and fidelity that gives us some confidence that that we can capture anything that we didn't intend. We also need to isolate the remote data server. So we have typically these applications that we're building. They're usually modern applications, web applications. Typically, are single-page applications that have lots of JavaScript that make invocations back to some remote data source using AJAX over HTTP that depend on some database. So we need to rip that out. We need to be able to sever this dependency from web services and instead be able to replace something in its place, right? That can mimic all the behavior that web service would have made, so that all this logic here of our components, all the rendering that these components generate, they're somewhat fooled into thinking that service is still there, right? But without actually going out to the service, without actually going to the database. And so what we could do, by replacing this, we can now have these services provide a known initial state and a known ending state. That if you hit if these JavaScript components read this particular data set, we know what the expected DOM would be, right? That we can compare. Is it behaving knowing the data that we're feeding it? Does it render what we expect? Right? And combine this technique along with the previous technique of severing of mocking the browser as well. Okay, so we need to be able to mock that service. The other one is simulating user interaction. Right, we have the user generating all sorts of a stream of events, right, to the browser, and those events are typically handled by some JavaScript engine, right, that has all sorts of event handlers that trigger all sorts of logic, all sorts of loops and branches and whatnot that are reflected in the generation of some dynamic content. Yes?
I'm confused, like how we do testing, because it's like the browser like inherently like gonna be different for each like browser. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah. So this the engine here that the browser uses for running JavaScript is pretty standard, right? And there's quite a few of these engines around. Node.js being the most common one, right? But they themselves are based on JavaScript engines that are very common in browsers. They pretty much use the same engine. Safari and Chrome, they all pretty much use very similar JavaScript engines, and it's pretty standard. And they would execute the code, right, with whatever code you give it here, but without being inside of the context of a browser. Like Node.js, for instance, allows you to run JavaScript from the command line. But then you don't have an actual window. You don't actually have an alert box. None of that is there, right? All it's gone because you're executing outside of the context of a browser. So nevertheless, we like to be able to mimic, right, this invocation, these events that stream over to JavaScript and generate the DOM that would be equivalent if this were actually running in a browser, right? So we need to be able to simulate this stream of events so that instead of the user actually clicking on the mouse, we need to have an API that says, hey, grab this hyperlink and click it, generate this event, this click event on that hyperlink, or hover over it, or enter, or exit, all on your mouse movements, and then all these events would be handled by the JavaScript. So we need to mock all that, and test harnesses like the one we're going to look at today can give us all these mechanisms. But we need to be able to simulate user interaction, okay, and replace it with a test that is in place of an actual user. All right, so let's look at the harness that the testing harness that we're going to be using to be able to simulate and replace a lot of these mechanisms.